The question is, what is disinformation, which is a relatively simple thing to answer at the surface level. It's a question of definition. Which is, the common definition of disinformation is something like a lie told to a specific audience for a specific purpose. And so to me, it's an inherently rhetorical question. In thousands of years of ancient Greek, going back thousands of years to the ancient Greeks, it was a question that they wrestled with very deeply as well. It's at the heart of the Western intellectual tradition. So disinformation is not some new phenomenon. It's been perhaps exacerbated or swelled by technology, and that's worth picking apart a little bit. But the answers that the ancient Greeks came up with in terms of how do you tell fact from fiction, and how do you sift out truth from the falsehoods that are bandied about in civilization, have to do with rhetoric. It's how do you evaluate the credibility of information. And it's also through, for Plato, philosophy, by having some kind of profound questioning of everything you come across. And it's through that philosophical process that you realize that you don't really know a whole lot about the world. And most people don't really know a whole lot about the world. And there are a lot of sophists in the world. So going back now in time, the sophists were those teachers of rhetoric who would show others how to speak very persuasively without having a handle of the topic in which they were engaging. So this is someone like Gorgias. Gorgias, the ancient Greek rhetorician, was a teacher for hire. And in Plato's famous dialogue, we see Socrates and Gorgias talking to one another. And Gorgias says, I can teach my students to speak on any topic. And Socrates then asks him, well, does that give them a knowledge of that subject? And Gorgias says yes. And how silly is that, right? Just because you can speak persuasively about medicine doesn't make you a doctor. It doesn't. You may be able to speak very beautifully about anatomy and physiology, and you may also be a doctor, but one does not create the other. One does not cause the other. Being able to speak intelligently about a particular, or seeming to speak intelligently, that's the thing, is to charm. Can you charm an audience? That was Plato's critique of the early rhetoricians. And so the ancient Greeks were grappling with this problem of, there's a bunch of people going around our cities who are very eloquent and seem to know what they're saying, but when you dig a little bit deeper under the surface, there's no substance there. They've just been taught the tools and the tricks and the techniques. Things like I just did there, alliteration, tools and tricks and techniques, using the repetition of that consonant sound at the beginning of the words, and the different ways you can organize your speech, and the poetic and literary things you can do with your speech, different forms of repetition, different types of allusions, and different ways to build arguments. So the sophists were teaching the tricks and the techniques without teaching philosophy, which for Plato was how you actually get to know the truth. Now today we also have scientific truths, right? So there's a problem here, which is, how do you evaluate credibility now using rhetorical methods in an age, applying these ancient Greek ideas to the present day? And we have to recognize that there are many different kinds of truth. I think this is the answer. Yes, scientific, empirical, reproducible truth is maybe the highest standard of truth that we have. If it's reproducible, If you can repeat the experiment and get the same results, or you can run the numbers, run the calculations, and they work everywhere, then there's something universal about that. Then, right? So truth has something to do with universality. It's always true. Something that's true is always going to be true. But there are so few instances of this in the universe that we can observe that it gives us a very limited basis on which to live our lives. There's no universal answer to questions like how should you structure your economy, or what should you eat for breakfast, or what should you do with your time, your limited time on this planet. There are no scientifically perfect answers to those questions, and there may never be. So, in the spaces where there are no perfect, reproducible, universal truths that can be applied, something like philosophy has to occur. Something like rhetoric has to occur, and that's Husserl's take is in the indeterminate spaces you have to battle it out, you have to communicate with one another, which is what we do in a democracy, but we're getting very bad at it, it seems, with the kind of ongoing culture wars and our dichotomy of the left and right and the US, and not having honest conversations about where we want to go and who we are, and getting kind of entrenched in these wedge issues. So truth beyond outside of the scientific realm, it's like you have to be evaluating the best evidence that you can possibly find all of the time. And that's Aristotle's concept of, right? You have those wonderful artistic proofs of ethos, pathos, and logos that we apply more broadly now. Ethos is that character or that credibility. We apply that now to things like information literacy and digital literacy. What is the credibility of some source? And, we can kind of rank order those, like a peer-reviewed source is of very high quality. It doesn't mean it's the absolute truth, though. We still especially, in the open-ended humanities fields, you might read some analysis of a novel or something like that and completely disagree with the take, and then scholars battle with one another. So, I would never say that you have to take peer-reviewed literature as the absolute gold standard of how you should live your life or how you should think. It's just a perspective that's been vetted by other experts within a particular field who have very specialized knowledge about a subject. Still, it's about the best that we can do. In the sciences, there's that each field has a different methodology, but it veers more towards reproducibility, and but that can vary quite a bit by field too. And often you'll see this happen, right? A study will be published in a peer-reviewed, top-tier scientific journal or psychological journal, and then some laboratories will attempt to reproduce the study and get very different results. This happens fairly frequently. So what do you do, right? How do you go about your life? Well, I mean, I think the thing we have to do is do more philosophy. We have to think more. We have to be unafraid to question. So to go back to disinformation, there's always people who are trying to tell you what to do and what to think and how to live and what you should buy and all these sorts of things, which God should you believe in, or don't believe in one at all. And philosophy is, and rhetoric is, a kind of antidote to that constant bombardment of persuasion, of rhetoric specifically because it gives you the tools to analyze the arguments that others are using, and then philosophy to formulate your own unique perspective on the world, gauging your own truth and your own understanding, which I would say that we all must do. And I don't mean academic philosophy here. I mean a kind of innate, embodied, internal, personal philosophizing that you must do to ask very difficult questions. Why do I believe such? Why do I believe such a thing? Should I really? Is there good evidence for it? Who told me that? Where did this idea come from? There's Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, 1976, the memetics, right? We're always, ideas can be like infectious. Ideas can get into our head and then we believe something, an ideology, and then we never question it. And we go about our lives never questioning it. And so these are tools, right? These ancient ideas from the ancient Greeks, because they recognize this is a serious problem if you can have people going around just making things up uh, and lying to you. And it's not conspiratorial. It's not some conspiracy theory to say that governments lie and corporations lie and people lie. I mean, it's demonstrably, you can demonstrate this over and over and over again throughout history and in our current times. Well, that's what disinformation is. It's a lie told to a specific audience for a specific purpose. And there's sometimes utility in this, right? This is used in warfare, for example. Think of World War II. In the preparations for D-Day, the British built a false city, a false military base with inflatable tanks and trucks and dummy buildings and all this sort of thing, because they wanted the Germans to think that they were going to land in such a location when really they were going over here, right? So that's disinformation. Or the letter that was, this is Operation Mincemeat, a letter with the details of the D-Day, false details of a D-Day invasion planted on a corpse that was then floated off to sea and just happened to have been picked up by German soldiers, and then so they've been disinformed, right? So, and this was actually very effective. The Germans rallied their forces in such a position, and Hitler was actually nowhere near the coast when the invasion actually took place, and so the chain of command was broken, and it was a disaster for the Germans, and because they had been disinformed, they had been lied to very intentionally for a specific lie for a specific purpose for a specific audience, which is what disinformation is. How do you know when you're being disinformed, when you're being lied to? And you have to develop a rhetorical capacity to sniff that out, essentially. And you have to evaluate the credibility of the arguments of everyone, right? And it's very easy to be fooled. You know, here I am with the suit coat and the glasses and the fancy degree, and right, you probably implicitly trust some of the things I'm saying, and I mean, I would say that you should. I'm of an ethical character, and I have read the ancient Greek texts, and I've thought about a lot about these things, but just one person's perspective, right? Politicians are very good at this. I remember George Bush putting on the helmet and, right, pretending to shovel, and you know, he wants to look like a working class hero, so we'll vote for him. That's a rhetorical act. It's an act of persuasion to look a particular way for a particular purpose, for a particular audience, to have a particular effect upon them. I'm going to imitate the mannerisms of what I think a working class person looks like, and that's how I'll get your vote. Well, misinformation then. Misinformation is something that's not true, that's maybe accidentally shared. So those are the kind of, by definition, the way that we separate those two ideas. I've also heard some scholars using the term malinformation, which is like true information that's shared for a harmful intent. I think that's a very small, those are kind of fringe cases, and on the outside, I don't think it's a very useful concept to think about. Um, Disinformation is very rampant. It's something that we're dealing with all the time. So there was this study by the Stanford History Education Group, which went something like 97% of the high school students in their study group, it was about 2,000 students or so, 97% of them didn't see a conflict of interest in a web page about global warming published by a fossil fuel company. Now, it doesn't matter what you think about fossil fuels and global warming here. I know that's a politically charged concept. Regardless of that, why would you want your objective information about climate change to come from a company that has a vested interest in it? It's a very apparent conflict of interest, right? A conflict of interest is like if you ask a fox to guard your chicken coop. Why would you do that, right? The fox is going to eat your chickens. We know we know this. Of course he would. Foxes like to eat chickens. You know, fossil fuel companies want you to buy their petroleum. Why would they publish anything that said that their product is complicit in, human aided climate change? They wouldn't do that. It's a conflict of interest. But 97% of the high school students in this study didn't see a problem with that. Why? Well, web pages are convincing. Web pages are rhetorical. Web pages are persuasive. You look at a web page, and even though we've been taught for, you know, like 2 decades at this point now, everyone says don't trust what you read on the internet, but we do, right? We see a web page and we say, oh, it must be legitimate. It's been vetted. It looks nice and all of these things. And at least 97% of the high school students in that study didn't see a problem with that. When to me, there's and to most people would recognize, a very clear conflict of interest. So a rhetorical skill set gives you the ability to stop and say, wait, just because this is a web page doesn't mean, it makes you stop and say, what does the speaker, what is this, the ancient term, the orator, the rhetor, what does the author, the writer, the creator of this text, this object, this media, what do they want me to do? That's a rhetorical question. What are they trying to get me to do? Oh, they're trying to get me to feel or think a certain way about this topic. It's not objective information. It's not the truth. It's a spin upon a particular subject. It's a particular case. The only way out of this mess, is to think for yourself. And for the ancient Greeks, that was through these arts of rhetoric and philosophy. Those were how you could develop the capacity to live in a way that you're not being constantly persuaded by others, because otherwise you will be led down a route by politicians, by corporate media, by corporations themselves and their massive marketing budgets, from highly targeted digital advertising, from foreign digital disinformation campaigns that are levering artificial intelligence. If you haven't stopped to learn how to evaluate information critically and learn how to think for yourself, then you're just primed, you're persuadable. That's my case. So a little bit about disinformation and misinformation and the ancient Greeks. And Phaedrus, of course, that I teach with my students. I teach my students Phaedrus every year, and every year we learn more from it. Plato's case there, Socrates as a character appears and has this wonderful dialogue with Phaedrus, and what they come to is they say that you must first be a philosopher, then you may be a rhetorician. That's how they solved the problem of the Sophists, who were these, again, teachers for hire, these tricksters who were teaching people how to be persuasive, but not to be great thinkers. Socrates is saying, first you must think, then you may speak. And where we have gone wrong, I believe, where we have gone wrong socially, as a society, as a civilization, globally, is we've forgotten how to think. We haven't bothered to stop and think. Maybe the reasons for that we could tease out for a long time. You know, we're going too fast, our lives are too stressful. Who knows? Precisely, it would be good to stop and say, why are we not being philosophical? But for the sake of where we are right now, this is enough to think about. Why don't you comment below if you have some ideas about why are we not a philosophical people? I don't think it's an American problem. I think it's a global problem. I think that that Americans can be very philosophical. I think many people are philosophical, but people we see in positions of power are not philosophical. Seldom. Like cookie cutter robot zombies for the most part. When I watch presidential debates, or I listen to some of our senators speaking, it's like ideological bullet points. They don't seem to be deeply engaging with any issues that matter to the majority of people who live in our country, live in these states that they represent. Let me know what you think. Where have we gone wrong? Why are we not a philosophical species? Maybe because it's hard. Maybe because it's difficult to stop and say, maybe everything I've been taught is wrong. That's a very painful thing, to stop and say, why do I believe X? Why do I believe things are such a way? Could I be wrong? Could I be wrong about my very worldview, about everything that I hold true and dear? The philosopher has to face that. If you want to be philosophical, you have to recognize the possibility that you haven't fully investigated some element of what you believe. Well, good luck out there.